As a producer who works with live instruments, you are inevitably going to reach a point, usually with drums, where you're going to need to reinforce something, but you don't necessarily want to replace it or replace all the parts of it. And when you do reach that point, as many of us do, you're likely going to be reaching for this, slate trigger, which is what we'll be exploring today. So to play around with it a little, I've opened up this old session. This is a song called Slain in Rage by mine and Toby's band, Bloody Pineapples. I know the name is stupid, but it is a fun band. And when we did the track originally, the drum parts we got were a little bit rushed. The whole track was rushed. We were on a real kind of tight time crunch because the whole thing was for a bit of a songwriting competition. And we didn't have the time to get exactly the sounds we wanted out of everything. Most notably, the kick drums are a little bit kind of soft and buried in the mix. And the toms, well, they can kind of punch out. They got a lot of bleed. And the snare has a lot of top and not as much wire. My intention with this mix is to make it very heavy, almost oppressive. You want a lot of energy and a lot of things that almost make it feel physically heavy to listen to. So we're going to take a listen real quick to the intro, and we're going to hear how it sounds with the natural drums. And then we're going to dig into what I've done to the drums using trigger. So you can probably tell the kick drum's not really there. It's very kind of buried in the mix, and it's all low end. There's not really much attack in here. And the toms are coming through, the snare is coming through, but they could just be a little bit stronger. So I'm going to go over here to this part of the song I have. It's a little bit heavier kind of area. You get a little bit of everything. And we're just going to start playing around. So first we'll take a quick listen without the extra trigger parts, and then I'll add them in as we're playing. If you're unfamiliar with trigger, essentially what it is a noise gate that filters out only the hits you want, depending on the sensitivity settings you've given it, and replaces them with samples from any TCI you've loaded in. And you get a very basic mixer view here, and you can control the level of everything, blend in how much you want of each. You can turn up and down the tuning if you want it to be a little higher, a little lower. You got these pan controls here, which you can use for toms or just to add something in with a little extra stereo field if you're trying to go for an effect. So here on the kick drum, I have Toby's blend from our green TCI for the kick. I have all three mics, all three close mics from the right kick on the silver TCIs, which we have dropped recently. And then I've blended in the classic kick 10 just for good measure. You'll notice if you look at the phase over here that the Toby kick is inverted just because it is out of phase with the others. When you invert it, you get a little bit more of that low end rumble. But when blending these five together, you get a really nice blend of the really sub-low with the attack from the higher mics and a little bit of extra body from the other two. And the whole idea is to just make it that much fuller and that much thicker. So just listening to it in solo here. Bring in the original, you get just a little bit more fullness, a little bit more of that low end. Something that's going to kind of sit in the mix, but still cut through a little bit more and be much more heavy, much more aggressive. And as I said before, trying to capture that feeling of almost being physically heavy to listen to. That low end rumble is going to really help you get that. So that thick kick drum. Moving on to snare, if you listen to it, you'll see that it's coming through quite nicely, but it could use just a little bit more saturation and bottom. There's a good ping, but you want a little bit more of that sizzle. And so what I've done for this one is I've thickened it up a little bit using a couple of samples. In this case, I've taken all 3 snares from the silver kit, and I am using the top mic on 1 and the bottom mic on 2 and 3. I've run it through Faturator here, which is a cool sort of saturation plugin. This is from Kilohertz Audio. This is one of my personal favorites. Any of the EDM guys out there are probably already going to be familiar with it. Just to add a little bit of that sort of buzz and aggression. So I'm going to bring in and out the snare. You'll hear a little bit more body in the snare, as well as a little bit more of that sizzle from the wires. And that'll kind of thicken up the sound a little bit. And, well, it's not as clear in the mix. It just helps it kind of sit a little bit more, gives you a little bit more presence, makes the snare a little bit more forward. And with this sort of sound, again, you just want that snare really in your face. So I'm going to play it in and out. Just notice a lot more ringy, a little bit more pingy, and a little bit more thin. Bring it back in, just a little thicker, a little heavier. Moving on to the tom here, another thing that I've done is I've set a gate on the original tom track that will only trigger off of the trigger track I have as well. And that gives you a little bit less of that bleed that we were dealing with. You can see here I'm using the gate from Kilohertz, once again. Fantastic, I recommend Kilohertz to anybody. Now each tom has its own trigger track. In this case I have tom 1, which is going to be tom 2 from our green set of TCIs. Tom 3 and 4 are going to be tom 2 and 3. Silver only has 2 toms, so I wasn't able to work it on this one. There's not much to show for the tom other than just the ability to kind of gate it out and add a little bit of reinforcement just to make it punch through just that tiny bit more. Simple as that. One last feature of Trigger that is really cool is the ability to turn audio into MIDI. So if you're having issues with something, for example, like a lot of bleed, and you want to reduce it down and you're having difficulty actually getting the threshold to read, or you just want to trigger, in addition, even more samples that you don't have TCIs for, all you simply have to do is go down, bottom left here, you're going to clear the buffer. Basically, it records the triggers that happen that you'll see up in this window here, and you can convert that into MIDI. But it does that as it plays. So if you've been playing before, if you've been setting up your samples, you're going to likely have extra stuff in the hopper here. So once you got that cleared, you're just going to play the part you want to get. And just above that, you're going to take the drag on track. Depending on the DAW you're using, you might actually have to set up a MIDI track for this ahead of time. In Logic, I can just drag and drop it. As you can see, the trigger did not pick up that middle hit. Now, typically, I just dial the sensitivity in until that's hitting, but the idea here is that I can basically pull this up. We're going to pretend that that's a ghost note. It's just too quiet and you can't get it in without having too much bleed. And so the opportunity I have here is that I can take that and I can draw in an extra hit. And as simple as that.